But my thesis is that you and I are alive at this extraordinary moment in which the dominant mental map in which we are locked is fundamentally life-denying. And here's the problem with it, is that its premise is lack. Lack of goods and lack of goodness. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough food, there's not enough energy, you name it. So I've summarized it here as the scarcity mind. That basically this can be summed up, we hear the slogan, seeing is believing, but actually my point is believing is seeing. So what we believe, this mental map, is all important. And here then is a summary of what happens in the dominant mental map. I call it the scarcity mind, this premise of lack, there's not enough of anything. The scarcity mind sees the world as separateness, stasis, and scarcity. I think of it as the 3 S's. And of course, if there's not enough, and add to that, there's not enough goodness in us, if we're basically just selfish little shoppers, if you peel away the fluff, all you can count on is our selfish nature, then this is a really scary place to be. So it doesn't surprise me one iota that depression is a global pandemic, and that suicide today in the world is 50% greater killer than homicide. That we live in a state of perpetual fear once we come from this premise of lack, the scarcity mind. So the worst part of it, though, I'm going to suggest perhaps, is that we distrust ourselves. That this distrust, because we are locked into this premise of scarcity, we don't believe that we are capable of democratic problem solving, and we become then trapped on what I call a spiral of powerlessness. Now, I'm just going to quickly take you around this idea of the spiral of powerlessness. From the scarcity mind, the premise of lack of goods and goodness, we don't trust ourselves to come together, to solve problems together. We believe that we have to turn over our fate to others, some expert somewhere, or preferably to some infallible force, some automatic mechanism that just sort of sorts things out for us, because we ourselves are too flawed to really engage with one another to do it. And so in the US, when Ronald Reagan named it for us, he gave us a perfect term. It is the magic of the marketplace. If we just allow it to operate on its own without any mucking up by these dangerous little selfish selves, we'll be all right. But unfortunately, from that, we did not see that we had taken a particular idea of the market. The idea of markets have served humanity for a very, very long time. But we hit upon this kind of wacky notion that the market can work if driven by one rule: highest return to existing wealth, people who already have the money. So what happens is wealth accrues to wealth, until, not surprisingly, we do end up with a world in which today 71% of the world's people are living in countries where inequality is increasing. Inequality in the United States, economic inequality is greater in the United States today than it is in Egypt, than it is in Yemen. It's severe. So then what happens then, this concentration of power, economic concentration continues. We see it in the food system, which I'm going to be focusing on tonight, dramatized in the United States by the fact that now the top 10 food companies control about half of all the sales of supermarkets. And on those boards, visualize this, sit about 138 people. 138 people, half of the products in our supermarket shelves, who are making decisions about that which is our fundamental life source, which has in the US become a health hazard, contributing seriously to 4 out of the 10 most deadliest diseases. We are turning our food supply into a health hazard. We start with the premise of lack. We turn over our fate to a marketplace that is concentrating economic power. We then see that no matter how much we grow, hunger increases. Just think about it. The United States and Canada. The United States is #1 agricultural exporter in the world. Canada is in the top 10 agricultural exporters in the world, and yet food insecurity is increasing in both of our countries. Certainly ours is much worse. Now about 16% of the US population is food insecure, and in Canada it's about half of that. But think about what that means. Two countries that are major agricultural exporters, and yet their own people are increasingly food insecure. So we end up growing more and more food, actually during this period of increasing hunger throughout the world, now almost 1 billion people. We have had strong global harvests, and as hunger has increased. And so what I'm suggesting here is that then this process of concentration, then the next step, this economic power, then begins to play out in the political arena. So we reach the point in this then that what happens, the infusion of wealth into the political system so that power inequities deepen, worsen, and then we look around and we say, oh, see, I told you so. There's so much scarcity, lack. Look how greedy Wall Street is. See, I told you so. People are just these selfish little critters, and clearly there's not enough to go around. If there's hunger right around the corner, there's not enough food. So this premise of scarcity just accelerates and accelerates until we reach this horrific point. I want to share with you one of my most dramatic quotes. I'll just show you this. This was 1938. Our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was addressing a joint session of Congress, and he said, "The liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." Roosevelt said this to us. Here we are. We're in this speeding spiral of powerlessness. And I often say to myself and others that really, it's not global climate change. It's not global hunger and poverty that is the real problem. It is this feeling of powerlessness that we can experience if we're caught in the spiral of fear, of powerlessness, of scarcity. So, here we are. How do we break free? My hypothesis tonight is that we are trapped in this because we are actually creating the very conditions that history and lab experiments on human beings have actually proven to bring out the worst in us. Here's what I'm suggesting, is that the reason we're in such trouble today is that we have absorbed a mental map that is fundamentally malaligned, perversely aligned with our own nature and with wider nature. And we've got to dig that deep and then ask, what is an alternative way of seeing that is evidence-based, that is lined with all we now know about ourselves? And so I'm going to suggest that one thing that's certainly clear about ourselves is that we know what conditions bring out the very worst in us. And I would suggest that they include concentrated power, lack of transparency, secrecy, as we saw certainly on Wall Street, where the slogan was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, meaning they knew how secret it all was when they were making their deals and selling these toxic products to us as good investments. They knew what they were doing, but they knew they were doing it in secret. And finally, the blaming of the other, the blaming culture. These three conditions bring out the worst in us. And so then the question, what can we do? Is it possible that we can break free of this frightening, depressing mental map that just locks us into feeling powerless? Neuroscience is showing us that actually, as we have new thoughts, it changes neural patterns in our brains that we can actually bring into our lives, stimuli that will allow us to create new mental maps, one much more life-serving than that which we are absorbing unconsciously. We can become conscious creators of a more life-serving mental map. And so I think that we can go from the 3 S's to the 3 C's. I'm suggesting that there is a for many decades now, this breakthrough of understanding of the nature of nature. And it is so obvious, whether we're talking about the physical sciences or the natural sciences, that it is clear that we are being told that the nature of life is this. It is connection. It is continuous change, and therefore the nature of life is co-creation. That we can break free the victimhood and the sense of being separate from one another. And one of my favorite teachers in this regard, it's a beautiful little book by a professor at Oxford University, Dennis Noble, who wrote The Music of Life. And he said, in biological systems, there is no central command telling the rest what to do. Rather, he writes, there is a form of democracy in which all elements are shaping all other elements of the system. And put more simply by my buddy in Germany, the physicist Hans-Peter Dürer, he said, Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. So we can leave behind this scary worldview of separateness and lack and begin to move into connection, continuous change, which means, by definition, co-creation. And here's the other piece of it. If we're all connected, then we're all implicated. If we're all implicated, then every choice we are making sends ripples out into the entire system. And the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world, because every choice we are making is changing the world. So this begins to open up a sense of possibility. And we can, with an EcoMind, begin to look at, and that's what I do in the book EcoMind, I start to take apart some of the messages, even of my dearest buddies in the environmental movement, some of the messages that keep us unwittingly locked in the scarcity mind. I'll just mention one of them as I move forward. And one of them is simply the idea that we've hit the limits of a finite Earth, right? Wham, 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 we've hit the limits, and we've got to pull back. And I hear that message more or less literally often, and what I'm suggesting, that ups the fear quotient. And actually, thank goodness, in fact, it doesn't reflect reality. Because if we look through an EcoMind at what is really happening, it is absurd to think that we have hit the limits of a finite Earth as if it is skimpy nature that we have to worry about. Actually, we are creating the waste and destruction. The idea that we've hit a limit takes the burden off, we think, oh, it's nature out there, rather than recognizing the systems of waste and destruction that are built into our one rule economy that so concentrates wealth. And so we can challenge these messages that feed the fear. And we can move then into what I think of as a spiral of empowerment and a spiral of possibility. But to do that, and let me just add there, that I don't call myself an optimist or a pessimist, I call myself a possibilist. And it's really important distinction I'm making here, because as we shift from the scarcity mind to the eco-mind, what is the most thrilling piece of it is the sense of possibility. Think about it. If we're all connected and change is the only constant, then of course possibility is moment to moment. It is unpredictable and it is constant. So, to really move in this spiral of empowerment, we have to start back with who we are. What does it mean to be a human being? And so I would suggest that there are, and this is increasingly confirmed by the new anthropology, archaeology, neuroscience, is that we have at least 6 magnificently pro-social qualities that we can count on to make this historic planetary turn toward life. And you can see them listed here, beginning with empathy and ending with imagination and curiosity. These are now confirmed with everything from little studies with toddlers that I'm entranced with now that I have grandbabies, but also with neuroscience looking at our MRI scans as we compete or cooperate. And do you know that when human beings cooperate, that the centers in our brains fire and are just light up as if we were eating chocolate? It's that pleasurable to cooperate. So that's a lot of evidence there that we evolved with a lot of reinforcement for cooperation. So, okay, If we have all these, if we're so great, then what's our problem? And the EcoMind gives us an answer, because we realize that we are like any organism in the ecosystem. Whether these qualities show up, or equally, we know that in the wrong circumstances, in those three conditions I mentioned before, concentration, secrecy, and blaming, most of us can be brutal to one another. Brutal to one another, whether we're talking about the Holocaust not being just a few madmen, but a lot of ordinary people participating, or lab experiments where we've been the guinea pigs and we have not shown up very well. So we know that yes, we have all these, but we have other dimension as well. Much depends then on what are the conditions that we ourselves create to elicit these 6 positive conditions. And as I said, I think we are pretty clear then that we reverse the negatives and we begin to see the possibilities for the continuous dispersion of power, transparency in human relationships, and cultures of mutuality, not just blaming, not just doing for one another, but cultures of mutuality. And I saw that both here at the stop, the kinds of programs underway, certainly in the USC programs, certainly in the food share I saw today, that spirit of mutuality that I want to return to. And so then it means that we can enter this spiral of possibility I call the spiral of empowerment. If we start from the premise that we've got it in us, but we've got to create the conditions to bring out those pro-social qualities, then we have direction. We know what to do. And so we can then begin to recognize that, yes, if we do have these qualities in us, we can do what is necessary to come together in deliberative problem solving, and so that we then step up and gain the courage to remove the power of money from our political process, which then begins to allow us to create democratically set rules around the marketplace, and so that they remain open and we can be co-creating a true living democracy.